Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Throne of Jade by Naomi Novik. So this book is book 2 of the Temeraire series, and you can tell how much I enjoyed the first one by the fact that I've already read the second one. Hell, I honestly bought the second one as soon as I finished the first. Throne of Jade picks up not long after where the first book ended, building on some hints that come in the last chapter of His Majesty's Dragon. Hints about the fact that the Chinese are not going to be happy when they realize that one of their highest class dragons has somehow accidentally ended up in the hands of a British naval officer. The Chinese have appeared in England to basically demand Temeraire be returned to them, and of course Temeraire doesn't want to leave Lawrence, and so refuses to go. And it turns out it's not exactly easy to make a dragon do something he doesn't want to do. Now, there's a little bit of back and forth while they negotiate, trying to figure out how to convince Temeraire to go, or convince Lawrence to convince Temeraire to go, but eventually someone just suggests the really obvious solution of sending Lawrence with Temeraire to China. So Lawrence, Temeraire, and their crew set off on a long sea journey to China, accompanied by an ambassador, and with the assignment to try to convince the Emperor of China to let them keep this dragon. And as a casual side quest, to also convince the Emperor to at least remain neutral in the war against Napoleon, and maybe even open up extra trade with the English. So, you know, not asking much. And as is true for a lot of second books in series, especially second books that are journey books, some of this book feels a little bit less like a tight, coherent story and more just like shit that's happening. It feels a little bit like a random series of events. And the thing is, I enjoy all the events. And impressively, in retrospect, yeah, all these random events actually are thematically relevant to the greater story. For example, there's this section near the beginning where they have to stop in port to get some supplies, and the nearest port happens to be a slave port. Now, Lawrence is an abolitionist, or at least he believes in ending the British involvement in the slave trade, which isn't quite the same thing, but for a moment, I was pretty sure reading that scene that this was one of those scenes that's just inserted in historical-ish books that basically are just the author expounding how wrong an evil from the past is and showing how good their characters are by having their characters disagree with what's going on. And yeah, that is part of what's going on here. Objectively, it is set up to show off how good Lawrence is. But there's something else going on here too. Because it turns out this was all really heavy foreshadowing and building themes towards the question of freedom and rights for English dragons. And I really like this slow build-up. Just like how in the first book, Lawrence has a very slow build-up of dismantling his patriarchal ideas, and yeah, that does continue in this book as well a little bit, but this book is very much about the slow dismantling of Lawrence's ideas of how dragons have to be controlled and whether it's for their good or not. Now, I still also really like Lawrence, by the way. He's a character with a really believable amount of jingoistic, Anglo-centric arrogance, to put it bluntly, but he's also, importantly, willing to learn. There's a reason people tend to like prodigal son stories. We like characters that don't start out perfect paragons of empathy and understanding, but who grow, who develop, who become better. And that's what Lawrence does. Lawrence is willing to have his eyes opened, and that makes him intensely likable. So I talked a lot in the review of the first book, His Majesty's Dragon, about the historical tone that these books managed to create, how they managed to just hit the exact right amount of historical language to sound like it was actually written in the 1800s without creating a barrier to the reader's enjoyment. And this book, yeah, it's equally noticeable, but here it's less about the language and more about the morals and ideals. One of the things that has always fascinated me in both books and just the real world is the way that morals, principles, and priorities are vastly different to different cultures. Like, we perceive, especially morals, as something that is just written in stone, something that is just true across the board. But if you look at different cultures, it's not always true, especially different time periods. And this is a world with a very different set of morals than ours, where it's perfectly alright and honorable to kill dozens in battle, and then immediately invite the surviving captured enemies to dinner, because that's the proper honorable thing to do with them. And where it might actually be, honestly, more desirable to die honorably in battle than to live dishonorably, where personal rights are really not as important as duty to king and country. And that is not the way most modern Americans perceive things. And in a weird way, Temeraire, the fucking dragon, is the modern reader's cipher. Temeraire is a fabulous mix of intelligence and the naivete of a child, which makes it believable for him to have curiosity and the willingness to question the culture and traditions he's surrounded by. And so he is often the one pointing out to Lawrence and the others the absurdity of English culture at the time, which allowed Novik to introduce some really modern morals and ideals to her 19th century characters, and actually have it feel earned. It's a great way to have a book in an era with some really shitty things happening. Have the characters start out with the believable morals of their eras, and call them out on it. Which is something I do feel is often a problem in historical-ish books. Either books manage to perfectly capture the era too well, and the characters do express and live morals that we find a little bit repugnant. Characters end up treating women like children, assume that anyone from Asia, Africa, or the Americas is savage and less than human, and think that the poor are inherently stupid, lazy, and immoral. This makes reading feel accurate, but it also makes it a hell of a lot harder to like the characters. And often you'll find this exaggerated in historical-ish books, because when you read the actual literature of the time, that shit's not brought up because it's just part of the built-in culture. Whereas historical books often feel the need to call the era on this, and therefore they sort of push it in your face. But on the other side of that, we have books that are set in this world with characters that just magically know that the morals of their era are wrong. We'll see, like, male characters walking around going, yes, I know that women are oppressed, even though no woman has ever directly told me. Generally speaking, we share the morals of the world we're born into, the world we're raised in. Unless something sparks a change in us, we often have to see something to open our eyes and make us realize that the shit we learned in kindergarten is not always true. In the real world, sometimes it really is just a matter of happening to be in the right place at the right time to see the right thing to have you go, oh, this is a problem. Like, honestly, some people in the antebellum South did look around and see the abuses of enslavement and go, oh wait, no, that's really wrong. But the sad truth of the matter is the majority didn't. The majority grew up hearing that enslaved people had to be enslaved for their own good and never questioned it. Which is why it starts to feel a little bit dishonest when you have characters in books that just magically know what they're seeing is wrong, with no outside prompting. Often, to me, it ends up feeling like the characters are Mary Sue's. They're characters that basically represent the author's wish fulfillment, the desire to step back into time and just say to these people, look around and see what's wrong. And that doesn't feel natural. And the Temeraire solution is actually a perfect way around that. He is not going to automatically buy into the morality of 19th century England because he's an outsider. Dragons are not allowed to exist within the norms of culture. They are kept on the outskirts, and therefore he is looking at it from the outskirts. He is also intelligent, and everything is still new to him because he's like 2 years old at the end of the books? I don't know. But he is in the perfect position to prompt growth and revelation in the people around him. And in this book in particular, we also focus on the rights and the humanity of the dragons themselves. And for that particular question of morality, he is one of the creatures who's being given the short end of the stick by society. And yeah, the oppressed are always going to be more likely to notice the oppression. Who would have thunk it? But that means that we have a character who is perfectly positioned to call out the era and not feel like a author self-insert. And also I will say that this book does not shy away from the horrors. Specifically, the horrors of war are really evident in this book. This book has almost a red shirt effect in some places, where they'll introduce us to minor characters, give us just enough page time so that we care about them, but not so much that we care too much, and then kill them horrifically on the next page. The book really only features a couple of relatively minor battles, and yet somehow has dozens of named character deaths. Now, some of this is retrospect, so it doesn't really feel the same way. Like, you'll see someone ripped to shreds and then afterwards hear their name, so you don't have an emotional attachment to those characters. But it is still a lot of character death, which is objectively authentic to war. Also, a side note on this, I really love the weird historical feeling of the moments where they have a battle and then, like, as soon as combat is over, both sides immediately default to calm, polite, and honorable. Now, the thing is, I don't know if war really ever was that honorable. I somehow doubt that there was any point in history where you could shoot a man in the back and then turn around 10 seconds later and be like, "Here, tea." But it's accurate to how people imagined war at the time. So it's fun. The other historical thing that I really want to address in this review is racism. I'm not sure the way the English characters interact with the Chinese characters in this book is historically accurate, but I appreciate that. The English characters don't really look down on the Chinese characters. No one ever implies that they're stupid or barbaric. They are seen as respectable, powerful, intelligent, and politically important. They are seen as other and strange, rather than lesser. And I somehow doubt this is actually accurate. Thinking about what I know of how the English interacted with Asia throughout history, yeah, I doubt this is right. But fuck it! I don't want to read 300 pages of characters I'm supposed to like acting racist. So I'm happy with this historical inaccuracy. And it's not so badly inaccurate that you're like, yeah, that feels wrong. Like, there are a few moments that characters are clearly judging a little, but we don't have a lot of in-your-face racism, which it just makes it a more enjoyable read. On the other hand, Novik also does paint the Chinese as being clearly behind in seafaring and sea battle compared to the English. The Chinese characters are super interested in studying the English ships and watching the English, like, run drills in the Navy ships, and clearly seem to be trying to spy on them and maybe learn from them, which I don't really know if that's accurate or not. I know very little about China in the early 1800s, so objectively all the stuff that takes place in China, like, yeah, I don't know if it's accurate or not. I'm going to assume that Novik did more research than I ever have, and trust her, considering she clearly did her research for the other parts of the history, so I'm just gonna assume that's right, but I don't know. Besides that, this is a really fun book to read. There's a lot of action, but there's also a good bit of introspection, character building, and growth. There's enough intrigue to feel exciting without it becoming about the mystery of who to trust. Which is good for me, because, as I've mentioned before, I don't like books that are built around the tension of who the POV character can trust and who's going to betray them at any moment. Novik instead builds real tension on a personal level, with Lawrence and Temeraire trying to fight to stay together and return to England, and the question of what is the right course for them. But there's also the bigger level of tension, which is just the ever-looming threat of Napoleon. I will admit, as someone looking back historically, I often forget that Napoleon was a seriously terrifying threat at one point in history. He really was conquering like half of Europe, and England was not fighting for honor, they were fighting for their country's freedom. But I do think this book does a slightly better job than the first book even, of really establishing the actual fear that there was that England was going to fall to Napoleon. But again, like the first book, the core of this book is about the deep friendship and platonic love between Lawrence and Temeraire. It's about Lawrence learning how to prioritize Temeraire's emotional needs and how to balance those needs with his own and with his responsibility to king and country. I am someone who has never really gotten that feeling of responsibility to country. Like, I just don't care that much. I care about people, not flags. And so I often struggle to connect to characters whose duty is a driving force to them. But this book does manage to do a really good job of getting me to care. Especially, I think, because it's something that Lawrence himself struggles with. He's not a blind patriot. He is looking around, he is learning, he is looking at things with open eyes, and he's willing to see the faults in England. And that makes him a more likable patriot. I also suspect this series will continue to play with the tension between Lawrence's duty to country and his duty to his dragon, which is something I'm really interested to see where it's going. Which all ties back to actually what I was talking about earlier. In any book that is set in a historical time period, there's a tension between modern ideals versus those of the time, and we naturally want characters to come to our way of thinking, whether that be in the big ticket items like enslavement, or comparatively little things like just the balance of personal rights versus duties. And for this tension to be resolved in a fulfilling manner, there needs to be a journey. There needs to be growth, slow, gradual growth from one point to the next point. But it's not just a journey one way. There needs to be a journey of the characters coming to understand what's wrong with their world, but also a journey where the reader comes to understand where the characters are coming from, where their world affects their mindset, and how they live in their world. One of the magical things historical fantasy can do is help us empathize with people from the past in a way that we otherwise wouldn't be able to. Which might also help us come to understand what's wrong with our world too. Opening your eyes to a different way of thinking can open your eyes to really understanding the world you live in. And sometimes it seems you need a dragon to help you do that. And yes, in case you're wondering, I have bought the next book in the series already.